define forensic accounting? I was talking to somebody this morning and they said, what's that? And I thought, well, that's a good place to start. What is forensic accounting?
So technically it means accounting that can be used in a court of law. Forensic means to be used in a court of law. So whenever you're thinking of forensic science or whatever. Now, in more like conversational terms, and especially what we do is investigative accounting, to be even like if we wanted to break forensic accounting down even further, because technically a business valuation that's being used for litigation purposes is forensic accounting. Economic damages could be a form of forensic accounting because it's just accounting used in a court of law. But the way that my firm and the work we do, it's really investigative accounting.
And how would you define investigative accounting specifically?
Yeah, we're looking for, we're usually identifying what happened. Somebody needs to know, one of the number one in an embezzlement case, somebody's always saying, the call we get is, hey, Leah, there's something wrong with cash, which I know probably fits really well for this podcast. But somebody's saying something's wrong with cash. And, we've looked at our operations. We think operations are fine. So we must have a leak somewhere else. And then we'll come in and I mean, gosh, 95% of the time when somebody calls me with that concern, there's some sort of fraud involved.
I was talking to Leah beforehand. When I was writing my book and looking things up, I found a stat from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. Is that right? ACFE. Yeah. And this was 2018. It was fresh information at the time, but 5% of sales in business in the United States is lost to fraud. Sales. And our listeners who understand have heard us before, the average company in the United States makes 7% to the bottom line net before taxes. So if 5% of sales is being stolen, they're either wiping you out or they're cutting your net profitability in half. And I know we've got listeners, we'll get to this, of course, that go, oh, that's interesting. That happens, that guy over there, that's too bad. Never happened to me, right?
Right.
So what is most common as you're going into these investigative accounting projects, are you primarily seeing the fraud happening on the side of the owner or on the side of the employee? What's more common?
So most of the time, well, it kind of depends. And we actually categorize these separately. So there's certain kinds of engagements that we're hired for most often. We used to be hired a lot in divorce. We just completed our last divorce case, and I'd like to keep it that way for a little bit.
Why is that? Why?
Yeah. So, oh my goodness. All right. No, anyway, so we try not to do a lot of divorce anymore. It used to be about 50% of our work, but so it could be embezzlement, which is employee theft, which you mentioned, but then there's also partnership disputes. And that's when we end up seeing that one of the owners is, benefiting more than the other. It's not necessarily criminal fraud, but it's definitely civil fraud in those types of things. And then we also end up working theft out of like estates and trusts or guardianships and things like that. So those are our three big areas and kind of how we categorize them. So what's more common between employee embezzlement and partnership dispute? It really depends on the year. Right now, for some reason, 2022 just set off this like chain of partnership disputes for us. So the majority of our work right now are partnership disputes.
I would imagine something with all of the stimulus money to businesses had something to do with that. The infusion of cash was too big to not create some sort of chaos.
Right. But, and back to the, like, we should have more cash than we think we have. It's, I think there's also because usually in a partnership or even in an employee embezzlement situation, there's somebody that's handling the financials and then somebody that's not watching. Like that's what's similar in both situations. And so in either situation, especially after all this money was infused because of the pandemic, then I think there's an expectation by the non-money person in the relationship that, oh, we should have a lot extra. And so whenever they don't, that's what's triggering I need to look at this. So,
yeah.
And also I was mentioning to Martin earlier before we recorded that like right now, money is expensive to borrow. And so people are looking for, why is cash tight, or cash is tight? Does this make sense? How can I find ways to cut costs and things? And whenever that starts happening, which is normal in a recession for my work, our work actually goes up, because whenever they start looking, that's when they find problems. So we do have those signs, kind of similar behaviors of a recession right now, because they can't go just borrow to make up for that difference.
Well, I had talked to Leah about this before too. I was in one of my companies a victim of fraud. Big to me, but relatively small perhaps to some, $340,000. But when I think back over the years, I look at financial, well, never mind all the details, but that cash thing, you have small enough business, you just got this idea, probably ought to have $230,000, $40,000 in the bank. And the bank calls up and say, I got a $30,000 check won't clear. What? Well, it just so happened the person I called to rectify that was the person who was stealing the money, and she moved some things around. But man, there were a lot of warning signs as I went along. Man, that just doesn't seem right. But I had trust, and it betrayed me. So
yeah.
Yeah.